The void had been silent for 1,000 years. The ghost fleet of Tarvax Prime, a massive armada of warships belonging to the long-extinct Tarvax Dominion, had vanished into deep space a millennium ago. No distress signals, no wreckage, no survivors. The fleet had simply disappeared. But now the dead were moving. A shockwave rippled through the galactic networks as scattered distress signals crackled from the outer sectors of the galaxy. Traders, mercenaries, and even military scouts sent fragmented messages. Ships of unknown origin were emerging from dark space, their hulls covered in ancient battle scars, their energy signatures unlike anything recorded. The Ghost Fleet had returned, and it wasn't alone. The war room was silent as the massive holographic display projected the latest footage. A Tarvax dreadnought, blackened by time and void exposure, drifted through the wreckage of a decimated fleet. No crew, no life signals, no biological traces, and yet it moved. High Commander Vorkesh, a reptilian strategist with cold, calculating eyes, studied the spectral fleet in eerie fascination. The ancient Tarvax had been one of the most ruthless warlords in the galaxy, but they had vanished without explanation. Now, their warships were attacking indiscriminately, erasing entire outposts with weapons that should have stopped functioning centuries ago. "Impossible," one of the counselors whispered. "They are dead." "And yet they kill," Vorkesh growled. His gaze flicked to the second projection, a human colony on the fringes of known space. A small, insignificant outpost. And yet, the Ghost Fleet had set course for it. A scoff rose from the gathered aliens. "The Terrans will be slaughtered," one muttered. "They will burn just like the others," another added. But Vorkesh wasn't so sure. He had fought humans before. They were unpredictable, and if the Ghost Fleet had chosen them as its next prey, then this battle might not unfold as expected. He narrowed his eyes. "Summon the War Council. I want to see how the Terrans die." The sky above Nova Terra split. Open, a gargantuan warship materialized from the void, its jagged hull cloaked in the shadows of a forgotten age. Rusted metal groaned as ancient engines reignited, their glow an eerie shade of blue, like the dying embers of a funeral pyre. The ship drifted unnaturally silent, its thrusters giving off no heat, no exhaust, just an ominous hum from the planet. Below, the humans stared upward, watching as the vessel loomed over their settlement. They had seen warships before. They had seen raiders, pirates, even entire planetary sieges, but this was something else. "That is a Tarvax dreadnought," whispered Lieutenant Kara Voss, scanning the spectral warship with her field binoculars. "That thing should have been space debris 1,000 years ago." Across the colony, alarms blared. The defense grid powered up, automated turrets pivoting toward the sky. But every sensor operator, every military officer, every seasoned veteran of war knew the truth. This wasn't a normal invasion. Commander Elias Rourke, a hardened officer with cybernetic implants covering the left side of his face, stood on the command deck of Nova Terra's central control tower. His hands were steady, but his eyes flickered with something just beneath his calm demeanor, calculated fear. "We've got inbound bogies," called out Lieutenant Omari, his fingers dancing across the console. "Reading 30 ships, all Tarvax design, all broadcasting nothing but static." A deep silence settled over the control room. It had been centuries since the Tarvax Dominion fell, their entire empire lost to history. No one knew what had caused their extinction. No one had seen one of their ships active in over 1,000 years. And yet, here they were, ghosts in the void. Rourke exhaled sharply. "Raise orbital defenses. Get me every available fighter pilot. If these things want to test us, we'll remind them why humanity has never fallen." On a distant world, far from Nova Terra, the elite strategists of the Zalcor Dominion watched in fascination. A massive circular chamber held a floating hologram of the battlefield. a live transmission from Zalcor spy probes that had been monitoring the Ghost Fleet's every move. High Commander Vorkesh stood at the center of the War Council, his scaled hands clasped behind his back as he observed the projection. The Tarvax fleet was closing in. "The Terrans will panic," one councillor said, clicking his mandibles. "They always do," another added. "Brute force warriors, they will fire everything they have, and when it fails, they will beg for mercy." Vorkesh remained silent. He had encountered humans before. They didn't fight like the others. They didn't follow predictable patterns, didn't submit to defeat like most lesser species. They adapted, they endured, and sometimes they won when they had no right to. Still, even he found it difficult to imagine a colony of unprepared humans standing against a force that should not exist. "Watch carefully," he muttered to his war tacticians. "I suspect the Terrans will surprise us. They always do." The first wave of attack came without warning. From the massive Tarvax dreadnought, dozens of strike craft poured out, moving with erratic, unnatural precision. They swarmed the colony like metallic wraiths, engines flickering with unstable energy signatures. Then came the eerie transmission. Across every human comm channel, a distorted voice, deep, guttural and filled with static, spoke in an ancient dialect. "We are the forsaken. We are the lost. The living shall burn." The message repeated in a haunting loop. Kara Voss shuddered. "Commander, those aren't Tarvax pilots. I don't think there's anyone on those ships." Rourke's jaw tightened. Then, "What the hell is flying them?" No one had an answer. The sky erupted in gunfire as Nova Terra's anti-air defenses engaged. Energy blasts tore through the void, slamming into the incoming ships. But the Ghost Fleet didn't move like a normal enemy. They didn't evade. They didn't break formation. Even as their vessels exploded, they kept advancing, undeterred by their own casualties. Rourke felt something cold crawl up his spine. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. "All hands to combat stations," he roared. "Scramble every fighter. If these things want to wipe us out, let's show them why humanity doesn't go down easy." The battle for Nova Terra had begun, and somewhere, in the distant reaches of space, the Xalcor War Council watched, waiting to see if the Terrans would fall. Or do the impossible once again. The first impact came like a hammer against glass. The Ghost Fleet strike craft swooped down from the sky, moving in eerie silence, their weapons charging with a sickly blue glow. The first plasma bolt struck Nova Terra's outer defenses, reducing fortified turrets to molten slag. Shockwaves ripped through the colony, shaking the ground as if the planet itself recoiled in horror. Commander Elias Rourke gritted his teeth as he barked orders from the command deck. "I want every combat-ready pilot in the sky now." Outside, the human counterattack launched. A fleet of Mark 7 Valkyrie fighters roared out of the colony's underground hangars, engines flaring as they shot toward the incoming phantom ships. "Engaging hostiles," barked Lieutenant Kara Voss over comms. Her hands were steady on the controls as she led the first attack squadron into battle. The moment she locked onto one of the ghostly fighters, her targeting system flickered. No heat, a signature, no life readings, no engine emissions. It was like chasing shadows. Her wingman, Lieutenant Duke Salazar, cursed over comms. "These things don't even show up on sensors properly. How the hell are they moving?" Voss clenched her jaw. "Doesn't matter. Weapons hot. Take them down." The first missiles streaked. Toward the enemy, vapor trails carving through the sky. Explosions rocked the air, consuming several Tarvax strike craft. For a brief moment, the battlefield tilted in humanity's favor. Then the destroyed ships kept flying. Voss's breath caught in her throat as she watched the burning wreckage of a Tarvax fighter continue its attack run. Half its fuselage was missing, flames trailing from its shattered hull, but it still moved, still fought. "Commander," she gasped, "they're not dying." Rourke stared at the battle reports. "That's impossible." But it wasn't. The Ghost Fleet wasn't just attacking. It was ignoring the fundamental laws of war. From the distant chambers of the Zalcor War Council, High Commander Vorkesh and his strategists observed the battle through their surveillance probes. "The Terrans are outnumbered and outgunned." One counselor muttered, "They will fall within minutes." "Yet they do not run," another noted, intrigued. "They do not plead, they fight." Vorkesh said nothing, his sharp gaze fixed on the strangeness of the battle. The Ghost Fleet should have annihilated the humans already. Instead, something unexpected was happening. The Terrans were adapting. Back in the command tower, Rourke analyzed the combat footage, his cybernetic eye scanning through layers of tactical data. The Ghost Fleet didn't react like living pilots. They didn't evade fire. They didn't communicate. They didn't hesitate. They were following a pattern. "Omari!" he barked at his tactical officer. "Run predictive modeling. See if these things are moving on a pre-programmed combat algorithm." Omari's hands flew across the console. Seconds passed. Then, "Commander, you're not going to believe this," Omari said, voice tight. "They're fighting the exact same way the Tarvax did 1,000 years ago." Rourke froze. He turned to the holomap, watching as the ghostly warships moved. In formation. Then it clicked. "They're running on old combat data," he muttered. "That's why they don't adapt. They're just repeating the last battle they fought before they vanished." Salazar's voice crackled over comms. "That's great, and all, but these things are still killing us." Voss suddenly spoke up. "Wait, if they're following an old war doctrine, that means they don't know about modern human combat tactics." Rourke's lips curled into a grin. "Which means we can exploit them." Rourke relayed his plan to the pilots. "Listen up. These things are fighting like they're still in the past. That means we can lead them into a kill box they don't even know to avoid." His voice turned steely. "I want every fighter to run the Haven maneuver." A silence hung over the comms. "Sir," Voss finally said, "are you serious? The Haven maneuver's an urban legend. It's never actually been." "It's about to be," Rourke cut in. "You want to win? We fight like ghosts against ghosts." The Haven maneuver was a high-risk, borderline suicidal strategy that required human pilots to cut all power to their ships mid-dogfight, letting momentum drift them silently into enemy formations. If timed correctly, the maneuver would place them behind their opponents, where no enemy, living or machine, would expect an attack. It was a crazy, impossible tactic, one that no rational force would dare attempt, which is why the Ghost Fleet would never see it coming. "Do it," Rourke ordered. Voss took a deep breath. "Copy that." Above Nova Terra, the battle shifted. One by one, human ships cut power, letting inertia carry them silently behind enemy fighters. The Tarvax ghost ships, locked in their outdated battle doctrine, didn't register the maneuver because it wasn't something that existed when they were last alive. And then the humans struck. Voss fired first, her railgun punching through the back of a Tarvax ship. It detonated instantly, the first true kill against the Ghost Fleet. Then the rest followed. A coordinated assault of human ingenuity ripped through the ghostly invaders. One by one, the ancient warships collapsed under the weight of a tactic they could never anticipate. The Zalcor War Council watched in stunned silence. Vorkesh narrowed his eyes. "Impossible," he whispered. And yet, before his very eyes, the Terrans were winning. As the last Tarvax strikecraft vanished in a hail of fire, a new sound reverberated across the battlefield, a deep, guttural pulse. The massive dreadnought, still hovering above Nova Terra, stirred. It had been watching. It had been learning. Rourke's blood went cold as the ship's dead energy surged. "They're evolving," Omari whispered. "They just figured out how to counter us." The Ghost Fleet had made its first adaptation, and now the real fight was about to begin. The sky darkened as the Ghost Fleet's dreadnought surged with unholy energy. For 1,000 years, it had been silent, a relic of a forgotten war drifting in the abyss. But now, as its phantom fleet collapsed, it adapted and it hunted. Rourke stood frozen in the command center, watching as new signals flickered across the holomap. "They're learning," Omari repeated, voice tight with disbelief. The smaller ships weren't evolving, but this thing, it just rewrote its own battle doctrine. The dreadnought's thrusters ignited, moving with impossible speed for something of its size. The colony's orbital defenses locked onto the behemoth and opened fire, but the shots phased right through it. "What the hell?" Voss muttered over. "Comms." Rourke clenched his jaw. "It's not just a ship anymore." His cybernetic eye zoomed in, capturing the glowing runes now spreading across the dreadnought's hull. "It's something else, something worse." The realization struck like ice in his veins. This was never just an AI malfunction. The Tarvacs hadn't just vanished. They had been consumed. The dreadnought's core pulsed, and suddenly all remaining wreckage of the Ghost Fleet began to stitch itself back together. Voss's squad, still in aerial formation, watched in horror as destroyed Tarvax fighters reassembled mid-air, burning hulls reforming as though time itself were rewinding. "This isn't possible," Salazar choked. "We killed them," another pilot whispered. "We killed them. And yet the ships were rising." "Fall back," Rourke barked into comms. "Whatever this thing is, it doesn't play by the rules of the living." The Ghost Fleet was no longer an armada. It was a graveyard that refused to stay buried. Across the galaxy, the Zalcor War Council watched in mounting dread. The strategists, once so confident in the Ghost Fleet's victory, were now silent. This is not war," one of them whispered. "It is something else," another murmured. Vokesh tightened his fists. He had studied the Terrans for years. He had analyzed their ingenuity, their resilience, their irrational defiance of death. But this was beyond even them, and yet the humans did not break. As the Ghost Fleet reformed, as the dreadnought prepared to unleash its final attack, the humans fought back. They had faced death before. They had fought the impossible. And somehow they had always found a way. Vokesh leaned forward, watching in fascination. What would the Terrans do now? Back in the command center, Rourke made a choice. "We're not fighting a fleet," he muttered. "We're fighting a memory, a machine corrupted by something ancient." His cybernetic eye flashed as he processed every available option. They couldn't destroy it conventionally, they couldn't outrun it, but they could break its mind. Omari blinked. "Sir?" Rourke exhaled sharply. "We baited the fleet into a kill box once. Now we do it again." His fingers flew over the console, rerouting every available human signal, not to fight, but to broadcast. "All ships, all comms, all satellites," he barked. "Loop every piece of battle data we've collected. Flood the dreadnought's systems, overload its memory." Voss, still locked in a desperate dogfight, barely had time to process the order. "You want to give it more data?" she shouted. "No," Rourke growled. "I want to drown it in its own ghosts." The signal blasted outward, hundreds of thousands of overlapping combat logs. Old Tarvax battles, human battle tactics, failed Ghost Fleet, engagements, false maneuvers. All of it slammed into the dreadnought's corrupted systems. The effect was instant. The runes on the hull flickered. The reforming fleet stuttered. The dreadnought slowed. And then it screamed. A horrifying, inhuman wail tore through every communication frequency. A voice not of the Tarvax, not of the living, but of something ancient and trapped within the ship. "We are the lost. We cannot be forgotten. We cannot—" The dreadnought convulsed. Its own corrupted data looped upon itself, creating paradoxical battle simulations, contradictions, endless reruns of battles that had never happened. It was trapped in its own nightmare. The core destabilized, and then the Ghost Fleet imploded one by one. The resurrected ships disintegrated. The dreadnought once an invincible relic, collapsed in on itself, burning in the sky like a dying star. Its final wail faded, lost to the void that had held it for 1,000 years. The battlefield fell silent. Voss, breathing heavily, stared at the empty sky. "Did we just kill a ghost?" Salazar muttered. Rourke leaned back in his chair, exhausted. "No," he said quietly. "We just proved it was never alive to begin with. The ghost fleet was gone, and humanity had survived the impossible once again. The Zalcor War Council chamber was silent. The ghost fleet was gone, but the humans remained." Vorkesh exhaled slowly. His subordinates waited for him to speak, to declare what had happened. But what was there to say? The Terrans had faced the dead and won, and for the first time in his life, Vorkesh felt something he had never expected to feel toward the human race. Fear. The battlefield above Novaterra was silent. Where once the ghost fleet had loomed, now only debris remained, drifting lifelessly through the void. The dreadnought's wreckage smoldered, its once impossible presence reduced to scrap. Commander Elias Rourke stood on the colony's command deck, his cybernetic eye scanning the horizon. The air was thick with the stench of burning metal, and the soft hum of emergency sirens filled the city below. They had won. And yet victory felt strange. Omari approached, tablet in hand. "Sir, salvage teams are sweeping the wreckage, but—" He hesitated. "There's no trace of anything biological. No bodies, no remains. It's like the fleet was just hollow." Rourke nodded. He had suspected as much. The Tarvacs hadn't returned. They had never been here to begin with. Whatever had animated the ghost fleet, whatever had made it hunt the living, was something else entirely. Something old, something hungry, something they had banished but not destroyed. Across the galaxy, the Zalcor Dominion was shaken. The War Council, once so sure of humanity's downfall, sat in stunned silence. The ghost fleet had wiped out entire civilizations. The ghost fleet had been unstoppable. The ghost fleet had been invincible, and yet the humans had killed it. High Commander Vorkesh stood at the edge of the war room, watching the final battle logs loop on the holoscreen. He had underestimated them. They all had. "High Commander," one of the strategists finally spoke, his mandibles clicking nervously. "What do we do?" Vorkesh turned slowly, his reptilian gaze sharp. "We do nothing." Silence filled the room. "Let them have their victory," he continued, voice quiet but heavy. "Let them believe they have ended the ghost fleet." His claws tightened behind his back. "But understand this. If the Terrans can outfight the dead, what hope does any living force have against them?" He turned off the holoscreen. "Pray we never go to war with humanity." Back on Novaterra, the colony began to rebuild. The dead were mourned, the wounded were treated, and the living, they tried to move forward. In the command center, Lieutenant Kara Voss stood beside Rourke, staring out at the battlefield. "We should celebrate," she said quietly. Rourke didn't respond immediately. Instead, he raised a data slate, scrolling through encrypted logs salvaged from the dreadnought's wreckage. His cybernetic eye flickered. "Sir?" Voss prompted. Rourke finally turned to her, voice low. "Before it collapsed, the dreadnought broadcasted a final signal." Voss frowned. "To who?" Rourke's fingers tightened around the slate. "We don't know." Voss exhaled, rubbing the back of her neck. "Hell of a thought." Rourke's gaze drifted to the stars, his gut tight with unease. The ghost fleet had been waiting in the dark for 1,000 years, and now something else knew they were gone. Something else had heard that final broadcast. Something else might be coming next. He took a deep breath. "Get the fleet ready," he muttered. "This isn't over. End."